About 685 million people in Africa consider themselves Christians. This makes Christianity one of the largest religions on the continent, with almost 50% of the population. However, this was not always the case. Just about 100 years ago, there were approximately 9 million Christians on the continent, equating to 7% of the population. This means if you're listening to me from Africa, most, if not all, of your relatives were not Christians just a century ago. And that is, of course, excluding Ethiopia and some pockets of Northern Africa that adopted Christianity much earlier. And that's where the 7% roughly were. So, how did Christianity become so dominant in Africa? And should we continue to practice it?
More Africa. More Africa. Yet more Africa. Yeah, more Africa. Where more Africa? Yenny. More Africa. Where more Africa? Yenny. More Africa.
It is a well-known fact that Christianity came to sub-Saharan Africa with the arrival of European missionaries. The first manifestation of this was in 1652, when the Portuguese formed the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. However, it was not until the 19th century when Christian missions to Africa dramatically increased. This was essentially because getting Christian converts was an extremely important and effective strategy for European colonizers to establish their dominance in Africa. Apart from being a good catalyst for colonization, Christianity also manifested itself as a means of cultural invasion, as conversion of Africans to Christianity was almost synonymous with westernization. Traditional religions and gods had a lot of influence and significance in the lives of African people. Unlike Christianity, traditional religions were not just a set of beliefs. They were incorporated and integrated into many dimensions of life, including people's social, political, and economic behavior. They also played a vital part in determining different customs and rituals, and this is precisely why religion had a significant place in all communities across Africa. This integration in different dimensions of life is a concept that most colonial powers failed to comprehend or chose to ignore, as many prominent Western scholars had the misconception that the influence of traditional gods was negligible and that it was purely theoretical and had no marked influence on life. In West Africa, missionaries encouraged and often forced people to renounce their traditional beliefs and accept Christianity. No regard was paid to African religions, as they were viewed by Christian missionaries as a pact with the devil, and missionaries were encouraged to undermine them. As a result, demolishing idols, destroying places of worship, and manhandling traditional African priests became very common. The missionaries would deliberately desecrate the African idols by destroying them or trampling on them to prove that the African gods were powerless. Such actions reinforced the supremacy of Christianity and Western ideology over African traditional beliefs. This caused many Africans to renounce their traditional religions and adopt Christianity and Western values. Both the Catholics and Protestant missionaries were present. They were heavily supported by the colonial governments and would receive financial incentives to expand their missionary activities. In turn, missionaries would help their respective colonial administrations to strengthen its position in Africa. The Protestants focused on opening missionary schools to spread the Christian dogma and Western values. The Catholics, on the other hand, were more ruthless and less tolerant of native traditions. They were hell-bent on eradicating what they considered to be barbaric pagan rituals. However, both the Catholics and the Protestants trained groups of native converts who were loyal to the colonial administration and mostly to the church. They instilled hatred for native African religions and traditions in the psyche of these converts and used them as intermediaries. These groups of newly converts were the African agents of colonization who worked for the missionaries. They were able to exert more influence on their fellow community members than the white missionaries would have ever been able to. This is exactly the reason why operating through intermediaries turned out to be an extremely prolific strategy for the missionaries to disseminate their imperialistic propaganda under the cloak of religion, and thus helping the colonizers tighten their stronghold on the continent. Conversion of Africans to Christianity came with significant benefits and favors provided through mission stations by the colonizers to entice Africans to convert, as merely exposing them to Christianity or preaching was not sufficient for conversion. Most loyal converts were appointed as village chiefs and were used to marginalize and suppress the voices of the Africans who rejected Christianity and held on to the native traditions. In some cases, missionaries would also adopt shady methods such as bribing the village elders and headsmen to evangelize. Western education was, however, one of the most notable tools they used. They deliberately instilled Western ideas in the minds of the students that had lasting impacts on the values and beliefs of these people. The hated Christian missionaries held, and the colonists' propaganda that there's nothing valuable in African traditions was transmitted. One by one, the native students bowed down to the imperialists and looked down their own traditional cultures. They saw their gods as evil and the prince of darkness, similar to the way Christian missionaries considered African people to be the children of darkness. This made them to also turn against their very own people who rejected Christianity and chose to adhere to their indigenous traditions. In their minds, the colonizer was the bringer of civilization who carries the good news to African savages. Such reprehensible means of proselytization, coupled with the missionaries' desire to get rid of the African beliefs, saw the introduction of new Christian rituals in Africa, which were utterly incompatible with native traditions. As more and more native Africans adopted Christianity and gave up their traditional religions, the unwelcomed intervention of Christianity rendered a fatal blow to the very core of African cultures by threatening the native African religions, social customs, and rituals. African cultures, unlike those of Europe, China, India, has often been despised, ridiculed, and even dismissed by outsiders. And thus, this is how Christianity came into Africa, used as a catalyst for damaging social cultural fabric of African societies. This conversion game also helped the colonizers hide how they exploited Africa under the cloak of philanthropy, as most Africans now think that colonization was a good channel for the good news of Jesus to reach them, completely blind to the horrors of colonization, exploitation, and the huge losses of culture and diversity. With that being said, there's no denying the fact that most of Africa is now dominated by Christians, and those who are practicing Christianity today are doing so not because of any visible colonial pressure, but by their own accord. The effects of missionary activities has been able to work through the transmission of religious values from parents to children. It is, however, important that we do not forget our past or look down upon our indigenous traditions, because if we do not appreciate and value our pre-colonial past as free Africans with our own rich indigenous institutions, we will never be able to break free from the psychological shackle of the colonial past. Christianity was